the suspended meridian height, the last photographer who sailed with the 1958 Antarctic team. What his last roll of film showed, there is a photograph that sat in a storage locker at the United States Geological Survey office in Denver for 43 years. It shows a man standing on an ice shelf in Antarctica, holding a large format camera pointed downward at an angle that suggests he is photographing something in the ice below him. The man is Ralph Lenton, staff photographer for the International Geophysical Year Antarctic Expedition of 1958. The photograph was taken by another crew member on January 14, 1958, 3 days before Lenton's cameras were confiscated by Lieutenant Commander Wallace Grant and placed in a locked metal case that did not reopen until 2001. When that case was finally opened, it contained 11 rolls of exposed film. 10 of those rolls documented exactly what you would expect from a scientific Antarctic expedition: ice cores being extracted, weather instruments being calibrated, research teams setting up equipment at temporary field stations across the Ross Ice Shelf, standard archival documentation of a major international scientific program involving 12 nations and hundreds of researchers across the frozen continent. The 11th roll was different. Ralph Lenton returned to the United States on March 22, 1958, aboard the USS Arneb, resigned from the USGS Photographic Division on April 1st, and spent 19 years as a commercial photographer in Bozeman, Montana. He died in 1977. He never published the photographs from that 11th roll. He never spoke publicly about what he had been asked to photograph. The only record comes from the film itself, declassified under a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1999 and released partially in 2001. Partially. 7 frames from that roll were withheld under exemptions related to national security and geological survey data that could impact resource extraction rights. 7 frames out of 36. Here is what the released frames show. Frames 1 through 8 document a geological survey site 120 miles inland from McMurdo Station, the American research base established on Ross Island. Survey point Tango 7. The exposed rock formations are ferradolorite, an igneous intrusion common to the Transantarctic mountain range. These frames show standard field documentation, survey markers, measurement equipment. Nothing unusual in the geological record. Frame 9 shows a dark rectangular opening in the rock face, 7 feet high, 4 feet wide, edges precise and straight, too straight for natural erosion patterns common to Antarctic wind and ice weathering. Frame 10 is a closer view of that opening. The rock surrounding it shows tool marks, parallel grooves with regular spacing. The kind of marks that occur when stone is worked with metal implements or advanced lithic tools. The marks are uniform, deliberate, purposeful. Frame 11 shows the interior of that opening. The wall is smooth, not ice-polished smooth, which has a characteristic matte finish, cut smooth. The surface shows no weathering, no erosion patterns, no accumulation of wind-borne debris or ice crystal formation. In Antarctica, where wind speeds regularly exceed 70 miles per hour and ice particles abrade any exposed surface over geologic time, a smooth interior wall means the space was either recently exposed or sealed against atmospheric contact for an extended period. Frame 12 shows carved symbols on that wall. The symbols are geometric, angular. They resemble cuneiform from ancient Mesopotamia, but match no known language. Dr. Harold Steinberg, who examined the frames in 2003 for the Antarctic Heritage Trust, described them as possessing structural similarities to proto-literate systems, but exhibiting precision that suggested advanced lithic technology. Advanced lithic technology means tools capable of detailed stone carving. The precision visible in frame 12 exceeds what experimental archaeology has demonstrated as achievable with stone-on-stone methods. That precision is the first anomaly. The second is the age of the rock. Ferradolorite is Middle Jurassic, 180 million years old. The rock Ralph Lenton photographed is geologically ancient. The symbols carved into it are not. Thermoluminescence dating, which measures when crystalline materials were last exposed to heat or sunlight, was conducted on rock samples collected from Survey Point Tango 7 in 1959 by a follow-up geological team. Those samples, currently stored at the Smithsonian Institution's Department of Mineral Sciences in Washington, D.C., were tested in 2004 using updated laboratory protocols. The results indicated the exposed rock surfaces had been worked, meaning intentionally modified by human or tool activity, approximately 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago places the modification in the terminal Pleistocene, the end of the last major ice age. The Antarctic ice sheet was already extensive by that period, covering most of the continent in ice layers thousands of feet thick. The site Ralph Lenton photographed would have been buried, which means either the site was not buried during that period, or it was accessible before burial occurred, or the dating methodology has produced an erroneous result. The dating is not wrong. Thermoluminescence is not perfect, but it is reliable within a statistical margin of roughly 10%. 12,000 years ago is the measurement. The margin of error allows for anywhere between 10,800 and 13,000, no, 200 years. That range overlaps precisely with the period known as the Younger Dryas, a rapid and dramatic climate fluctuation event between roughly 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. During the Younger Dryas, global temperatures dropped sharply, then rose sharply again over a span of approximately 1,200 years. Ice cores extracted from Antarctic drilling sites show clear geological markers of this event in their layered stratigraphy. What those same ice cores also show when examined using spectroscopic analysis is a deposition layer from that specific period containing particulate matter inconsistent with volcanic sources or typical wind-blown dust transport patterns. The particulate matter in the Younger Dryas layer of Antarctic ice cores contains elevated levels of iridium, platinum, and other rare elements strongly associated with cosmic impact events. The working hypothesis, which has gained significant traction among climate scientists over the last 2 decades, is that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a comet or asteroid airburst or direct impact that destabilized global climate systems through atmospheric particle injection and thermal shock. If that hypothesis is correct, and the mounting evidence increasingly suggests it is, then the period immediately before the Younger Dryas was climatically different from what followed. Warmer ocean currents, reduced ice coverage, more ice-free coastal zones, more accessible terrain. And someone was there. Humans with tools and symbolic representation. Humans who carved symbols into rock at a site that would be buried for 12,000 years until ground-penetrating radar detected subsurface voids in the 1950s. Voids, empty spaces where ice should be solid. Survey Point Tango 7 was identified because of a void. The 1958 IGY expedition documented the site, collected samples, photographed it, and filed a report with the USGS and National Science Foundation. That report describes the site as geologically interesting but scientifically unremarkable ferrodolerite exposure with minor water erosion. The carved symbols are not mentioned. The smooth walls are not mentioned. The dating results are not mentioned. What is mentioned in a footnote on page 47 is that further investigation was postponed due to logistical constraints and ice stability concerns. Postponed, not cancelled. Follow-up expeditions occurred in 1959, 1961, and 1963. None produced public reports. The site location is not listed in the publicly accessible Antarctic Geographical Database. Satellite imagery of the area shows ice cover with no visible rock exposure at the coordinates in Lenton's logs. Either the site has been recovered, the coordinates were wrong, or access to imagery has been managed. The third option is speculative but not irrational. Survey Point Tango 7 is not the only anomaly. Ground-penetrating radar surveys during 1957 and 58 detected multiple subsurface voids, geometric structures and density anomalies inconsistent with natural ice formation. Those surveys were part of efforts to map subglacial topography for resource assessment. Resource assessment means determining what minerals and hydrocarbons exist under the ice and whether extraction would be viable. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in Washington, D.C. in 1959, prohibits military activity, mineral mining and nuclear testing. It designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve. The treaty was negotiated during the exact period when surveys were detecting anomalies suggesting valuable deposits and evidence of prior human activity. The timing is worth noting. The official explanation is that the treaty was a triumph of Cold War cooperation. 12 nations set aside competing claims for peaceful research. True. But revisionist economic historians ask what would motivate nations to prohibit extraction from a continent known by 1958 to contain substantial coal, iron, copper, and potentially oil deposits. The answer typically given is that extraction was not yet feasible or economically viable. Antarctic operating costs were too high. That answer was plausible in 1959. Less plausible now when resource surveys detected not only minerals but subsurface structures raising questions about continental history that could not be answered in 1958. What does a government do when it discovers evidence complicating territorial claims? It classifies the evidence. What do multiple governments do when they discover the same evidence? They negotiate a treaty removing the evidence from national competition and placing it under collective control. This is institutional behavior. Governments manage information impacting strategic interests. The Antarctic Treaty manages access to a continent. It also manages access to the archaeological and geological record. Ralph Lenton's 11th role is part of that record. 7 frames are still withheld. The FOI A exemption cites geological survey data that could impact resource extraction rights, but the treaty prohibits extraction. The exemption is based on potential future rights. Despite the treaty, nations are preserving options, or the exemption is based on something else, something those 7 frames show that the release 29 only hint at. Frame 11 shows carved symbols, frame 12 shows smooth walls. What do frames 13 through 19 show? We do not know. What we know is Ralph Lenton resigned 3 weeks after returning from his Antarctic deployment. His cameras were confiscated by military command. He never spoke publicly about what he photographed. The site he documented has been systematically removed from public geographical databases. The film he shot was classified for 42 years under national security protocols and then released with 7 critical frames withheld under resource extraction exemptions. The pattern is consistent with managed evidence, not hidden. Managed, controlled, access limited, interpretation guided by controlling institutions. This is how empires handle inconvenient evidence, not destroying it outright, which creates suspicion, but classifying, withholding portions, releasing curated selections, ensuring interpreters now are those whose careers depend on not challenging official narratives. The Antarctic Treaty provisions can be renegotiated after 2048. Multiple nations are positioning. China has expanded Antarctic research presence. Russia has increased resource surveys. The United States has maintained continuous McMurdo operations since 1956. When provisions expire, resource rights will be determined partly by who demonstrates prior knowledge and activity. The nation proving most extensive surveys, research stations, and geological documentation will have the strongest claim. This is why the 1957 and 58 surveys matter. This is why the photographs matter. This is why 7 frames are still withheld. Those frames are not just images of rocks and ice. They are evidence of a timeline complicating the story about who was where and when. They suggest the continent we call the last pristine wilderness was not always ice and not always empty. They suggest the same managed ignorance applied to North American old growth forests and Amazonian civilizations has been applied to Antarctica. The carved symbols are still there. The voids are still there. The evidence exists, measurable, photographable. What is missing is access, independent verification, the full record. Ralph Lenton saw something in January 1958 significant enough for equipment confiscation and partial classification 66 years later. Released frames suggest ancient human activity at a site that should have been inaccessible. Withheld frames presumably show more. The question is not whether something is there. The evidence confirms the question is what that means for resource claims negotiated in 2048, and whether the public will have the full record before those negotiations determine who owns the last continent. If you found this useful, share it with someone who asks the right questions about what is missing. Stay curious.